This video is brought to you by Thrive Fantasy, the official daily fantasy sports and esports partner of the Jacksonville Jaguars. Thrive is all about player props for the top tier athletes, so you don't have to spend countless hours of research on sleeper players. The more props you win, the more points you receive. Thrive has given away $4 million in cash prizes and has over $140,000 guaranteed in cash prizes for Week 1 of the NFL season. Use the promo code JG9 when you sign up to receive a 100% instant first deposit match up to $100. Download the app or go to thrivefantasy.com. Sign up and prop up today. And now, on with our feature presentation. Making it to the Super Bowl is the pinnacle of any player's career. Of the over 1,700 players in the league, and of the thousands who try to make it to the league but never get there, only 100 or so get to play on football's biggest stage. If you get to play on Super Bowl Sunday and have a chance to play for the coveted Vince Lombardi trophy, you've made it. And it's even more special when you get to do it after years and years of losing. When you've suffered through so much turmoil and ineptitude, and now it all turns around and you finally get to experience some team success, it feels so good. Which is what makes this next story all the more heartbreaking. In 1981, when the San Francisco 49ers made it to the Super Bowl, veteran running back Paul Hofer, who had gone through so much, was unable to play in the game. And it wasn't because he wasn't good enough, and it wasn't because he was hurt, but rather was because the field the game was played on. He was held out of the Super Bowl because of the playing surface, and was denied his dream because of what was covering up the ground. And this is the story behind what might be the most heartbreaking end to a career in 49ers history. Before I talk about the actual event, we need some context to understand the player in question and just how awful his team was for practically his entire career, because it will help us to understand just how big of a moment this was. In 1976, in the 11th round of the draft, with the 305th pick, the 49ers selected Ole Miss running back Paul Hofer. He didn't do a whole lot in college, only scoring 2 touchdowns throughout his collegiate career, but the Niners were willing to take a flyer on the guy, especially because it was the 11th round, and the odds of anyone making the roster were slim to none. Of the 28 players taken that year in the 11th round, only 6 of them, or just 21%, even made it onto a roster. However, Hofer was one of those 6, and he made San Francisco's relatively low-risk gamble pay off in a big way. Even though Hofer didn't play a whole lot in his first 2 seasons, with guys like Delvin Williams and Wilbur Jackson getting the bulk of the reps, by 1978, he had worked his way into the starting lineup, since Williams was now in Miami, and starting running back O.J. Simpson was hurt. And after he was inserted into the lineup, he made the most of his opportunity. Anytime you're getting praise from a Hall of Famer like Jack Youngblood, who said that Hofer was a tough back who deserves some credit, and eventual 13-year player in Bob Brzezinski, who said that Hofer was a strong little back who was like a train, you're doing something right. Over the final 5 games of that 1978 season, Hofer had 345 yards rushing and over 4 yards per carry. He had a 5-game stretch at one point in the season where he scored 6 touchdowns. San Francisco was not a very good team that year, and we'll talk way more about that in a bit. But Hofer's emergence seemingly was one of the lone bright spots in an otherwise terrible season. But as impressive as his breakout was in 1978, it was the 1979 season where he truly put himself on the map. Hofer became one of the best dual threats in the National Football League, and led the league with 7.1 yards per touch. In the over 3-decade-long history of the 49ers, he was just the 2nd player, alongside Delvin Williams in 1975, to lead the league, whether it was the NFL or the AAFC, in this category. Hofer had 615 rushing yards on 5 yards per carry, but he was primarily used as a receiving threat, with 662 yards receiving. Over those final 10 games, he had 52 receptions for an average of over 5 per game. In fact, during that season, only 2 players had 600 receiving yards and 600 rushing yards. One was Baltimore Colts running back Joe Washington, who made the Pro Bowl and led the league in receptions. The other, Paul Hofer. The good news for Hofer was that he was establishing himself as a legitimate offensive weapon in the NFL. The bad news? His team was kinda trash. Paul Hofer got to San Francisco at about the worst possible time. When he was on the Niners, he was on a team that was the textbook definition of dysfunctional. I'm gonna give a brief rundown of just how bad San Francisco was, only because I would be here all day if I listed every single thing that made the Niners a mess for the second half of the 1970s. When Hofer got there in 1976, his head coach was Monty Clark. In 1977, it was Ken Meyer. At the start of 1978, it was Pete McCauley. At the end of 1978, it was Fred O'Connor. By 1979, it was Bill Walsh. Hofer, despite being on the same team for 4 years in a row, had 5 different head coaches. The position of the 49ers head coach had about as much stability as the Defense Against the Dark Arts teacher did at Hogwarts. And during the 2 years that Hofer was making an impact and contributing in a meaningful way, the Niners were the worst team in football. They went 2-14 in 1978 and 2-14 in 1979. Following up the worst season in franchise history, with the worst season in franchise history. Add that up, and that's a team that went 4-28 to close out the decade, winning just over 12% of their games. The defense was atrocious, finishing 23rd in the league in 1978 and 27th in the league in 1979. The offense was no better, finishing in the bottom half of the league in 1979, and the year before, finishing dead last by averaging a mere 13.7 points per game. To showcase just how bad the Niners were and just how much Hofer was struggling, he had a 3-touchdown game in 1978 against the Rams. And the Niners still lost. San Francisco had a stretch where they lost 18 consecutive games on the road, as the team failed to win a single game away from Candlestick Park in 1978 and 1979. However, when we hit the turn of the decade, something started to happen with the Niners. With Joe Montana now under center for the team, with Bill Walsh having some time under his belt to implement his offensive style, and with some savvy drafting and front office moves, San Francisco is finally starting to win some games. For the first time since the John Brodie years, and for one of the few times in their over 3-decade-long history, they were a good team. And in 1981, they finished the season with a 13-3 record, getting home field advantage throughout the postseason, and making it to the playoffs for the first time since 1972. It was a momentous occasion, and felt even more sweet for the guys who were on the roster in the second half of the 1970s and had to survive some absolutely terrible and gloomy years. The only problem? Hofer wasn't exactly there to celebrate. Right as the Niners were starting to get good, and right as the rest of the league was starting to take notice, Hofer struggled with some absolutely brutal injury luck. Let's go back to October 12, 1980, which was week 6 of the season between the Dallas Cowboys and the San Francisco 49ers. For most Cowboys fans and Niners fans, they remember this game as an absolute massacre. This was one of the more embarrassing defeats in the history of the 49ers, as they lost this one 59-14. San Francisco trailed 24-0 at one point, trailed 38-7 at halftime, and had just 225 yards of offense compared to 460 for the Cowboys. Dallas never turned the ball over. San Francisco, on the other hand, turned it over 10 times. It's sometimes hard to even muster up 10 drives in a game. To turn it over 10 times is absurd. And Steve DeBerg went 12 for 35 with 173 yards passing and 5 interceptions, posting a passer rating of 30.7, which is worse than if he did nothing but spike the ball into the ground on every single play. If it wasn't for some garbage time completions late, it would have been way lower. But besides the part where the Niners got completely beaten up, what many Niners fans remember about this atrocity is this play right here. Paul Hofer takes the handoff and gets 5 yards out of it. And then, he's slow to get up. In fact, he suffers a brutal knee injury and has to undergo surgery, missing the rest of the season. This injury took place on turf, which will become important in just a few minutes. What stinks about this was that Hofer was on pace to have not just an incredible season, but possibly an MVP kind of season. Through the first 5 games, he had 288 rushing yards on 4.9 yards per carry, and led the NFC with 41 receptions for 467 yards. He was on pace for 921 yards rushing and nearly 1,500 yards receiving. The single-season record for most yards from scrimmage at the time was set by O.J. Simpson in 1975, who had 2,243. Hofer was on pace to smash that. And now, he was done. Out for the season. Who knows what kind of career he could have had, but it was clear that in 1981, he wasn't fully recovered from the injury, and couldn't cut as well as he used to be able to. Though he would play sporadically that year, including a touchdown against the Cowboys in a 45-14 victory that was San Francisco's revenge game, an announcement to the world that they were legit, he would suffer even more heartbreak when in Week 15 against the Houston Oilers, after catching an 11-yard pass, he suffered another injury. The injury was going to sideline him for the postseason, with one catch. If the Niners advanced to the Super Bowl, he would be on track to play. It could have been an incredible comeback story on football's biggest stage. The only problem? Because of the playing surface of the Silverdome, that was never an option. You knew the injury he suffered in 1980 was problematic when in 1981, he said that he was contemplating retirement. He knew that his skills were diminishing, and that there was nothing whatsoever that he could do about it. Hofer said in November, even before the injury against the Oilers, "I can't cut as well as I used to. The bone damage is holding it back. If the bones don't repair themselves, there'd be no use in playing anymore." And after that injury against the Oilers, that stance of his strengthened, with him saying, "I don't want to leave football permanently crippled." As much as he wanted to play, he wanted to value his long-term health, and was thinking ahead beyond the 1981 season and to the next 50-some-odd years of his life. The good news was that he was in line to play the Super Bowl if the Niners made it. The even better news was that the Niners wound up making the Super Bowl. After beating the New York Giants 38-24 in the divisional round and the Dallas Cowboys in the famous catch game in the NFC Championship, for the first time in franchise history, San Francisco was playing for the title. So this should be his big comeback, right? This should be like what happened a decade and a half later with Rod Woodson coming back after tearing his ACL to play in the Super Bowl, which you can learn more about by clicking the card in the upper right corner. All was going to be good. After years of losing, Hofer was finally going to get the moment that all players dream of. Except he wasn't. Because the bad news was that even though he was healthy, he couldn't play in the game. It had nothing to do with a feud with the coaching staff. It had nothing to do with his play or being buried on the depth chart. It was because the site of the game was the Pontiac Silverdome, and that was a turf field. This was back in the 80s when turf posed a serious injury problem, and the Niners wanted to take no chances with him whatsoever. It's the same reason why Hofer played in all the home games, but only played in half the road games. If it was a turf surface, he didn't see action. If the game was played at Tampa Stadium, like it would be 2 years later, Hofer could have played. If it was played at Jack Murphy Stadium, like it would be later in the decade, Hofer could have played. But because the Silverdome had a turf surface, even though Hofer was able to go, he couldn't play in the big game. The Niners placed Hofer on IR, and he was absolutely dejected, and understandably so. He said, "I don't know if it's really hit me yet. The Super Bowl is something you shoot for, and I've been shooting for it since I've been with the 49ers. It's a real disappointment to miss out on it." And on January 24th, 1982, when the 49ers defeated the Cincinnati Bengals at Super Bowl XVI and won their first Super Bowl in franchise history, it should have been an especially sweet celebration for the guys like Hofer, who were there through the darkest days in franchise history, where winning any sort of game, let alone a Super Bowl, would have been a tall order. Instead, because of turf, Hofer had to miss out on his dream. Hofer retired the day after the game, and knew this decision was coming. He reflected on his career in the days before the game, saying that he was happy with what he did, but that he knew that as disappointing as this was, his playing days were behind him. I should note that Hofer would later sue the 49ers for their treatment of his initial injury against the Cowboys. He had to wait until later in the season before going under the knife, while Hofer contested that the severity of the injury was understated, and he should have gone under immediately after. However, either way, his days in the NFL were done. What looked like such a promising career evaporated just like that. Here was a guy who was on pace to becoming one of the best running backs in the NFL, and was on pace to being one of the best dual threats the game has ever seen. And then he gets injured, never to return to form. And then, after years of awful football, as his team finally becomes good and gets to the Super Bowl, because the game is played on turf and not grass, he can't play in the game. If there was ever such a thing as a heartbreaking Super Bowl ring, this would be it right here. Paul Hofer remains a giant what-if in the eyes of Niners fans who got to see the man for themselves. Because even though the man technically went out on top, he went out at the lowest point possible. Get your official Jaguar Gear 9 merchandise by going to jg9shop.com, and be sure to like this video, ring the notification bell, subscribe down below if you haven't already, as it helps the channel out a lot, and be sure to check out Twitch every Wednesday night at 9 p.m. Eastern for your chance to play NFL Trivia and win cash prizes. Link in the description below. If you want to see videos like this condensed down to 60 seconds, then follow me on TikTok at JaguarGator9 and subscribe to 60-second NFL History on YouTube. To see highlight videos of players throughout the history of the NFL, subscribe to JG9 Highlights. Also, special thanks to all of our Patreon supporters for helping out the channel. Your support is greatly appreciated. See how you can become a patron and request future video topics in the description below.